She didn't even have time to pray. 1 second she was standing on the bridge. The next she was falling blind, 62 years old and completely alone. Her cane hit empty air. Her scream swallowed the river. And the woman who pushed her, she was already dialing her husband's number to tell him the terrible news. Hello friends, welcome to Stories by Jason. Before we start, please do not forget to support our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing with your loved ones. Also, please let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Grace had lived 62 years learning to trust what she couldn't see. She trusted the smell of rain before it came. She trusted the way a room changed temperature when someone walked in angry. She trusted the feeling in her hands when she kneaded bread. The exact moment the dough was ready, soft and alive and yielding under her palms. She'd been blind since her mid-40s, a slow fade, first the edges, then the center, then darkness that was somehow never total. Shapes, light, shadows, not nothing, but close enough. And she trusted people. That was her real gift and her real vulnerability. She trusted David, her son, kind, a little soft, too in love with peace to ever fight for truth. She trusted her neighborhood, the worn path from her front door to the corner where the baker opened at 6. She even trusted Linda. At first, Linda had come into their lives 3 years ago like a bright warm wind, strawberry perfume, generous laugh, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's coffee order and asked about your knees when they were hurting. She called Grace Mama on the second visit. She held her arm crossing streets. She bought her audiobooks and imported the teas she liked from a specialty shop 40 minutes away. David was smitten, floored. Finally, he'd told Grace on the phone, finally someone who feels like home. Grace had said all the right things. She'd tried. God knows she'd tried. But something in Linda's voice never quite matched the words. It was like a song played in the wrong key, technically the right notes, technically the right melody, but something off in the tuning that only someone listening very, very carefully would ever catch. Grace listened carefully. She mentioned it once to David gently. He'd gone quiet, the way he always went quiet when he didn't want to have the conversation, and then said, "Mama, please don't do this." So she stopped saying it, but she never stopped feeling it. That Tuesday in October started the way Linda wanted it to start. Cheerful, ordinary, unremarkable. "I thought we could take the river walk," Linda said over breakfast, pouring Grace's tea exactly the way she liked it. "It's supposed to be beautiful this morning. Cool but not cold. I'll hold your arm the whole way." Grace had paused over her cup. The river walk. She hadn't been there in years. The path was uneven in places, and there was a stretch near the old toll bridge, she knew it from before her vision failed, where the railing had always felt unreliable. Thin, decorative rather than protective. "David isn't coming?" Grace asked. "He's got that conference call," Linda said. "Just us girls." A small laugh, warm as a fireplace. "I packed those almond biscuits you like." Grace said yes. She doesn't know why she said yes. Maybe she was tired of being afraid of her own instincts. Maybe she wanted to believe she'd been wrong all along. Maybe 62 years of trusting the world had worn a groove in her that was too deep to step out of in one morning. She said yes. The river smelled of iron and wet leaves. Their footsteps fell into an easy rhythm, Linda's heels quiet on the path, Grace's cane tapping ahead of her in that practiced sweep, left right, reading the ground like Braille. Linda talked. She was always talking stories about a neighbor, something funny she'd seen online, the color of the trees, the way the light was hitting the water. Her voice was a performance. Grace had always known that, but that morning underneath the performance she could hear something else, something that had no name, a low hum like a machine warming up. They reached the old bridge. "Careful here," Linda said, guiding Grace onto the wooden planks. "The boards are a little uneven." Her grip on Grace's arm tightened, not protective, controlling. Left right. The cane tapped. Grace counted planks the way she counted everything, by feel, by sound, by instinct. They were near the middle now. She could feel the open air on both sides, the bridge narrowing, the railing she reached for thin iron, loosely bolted, just as she remembered. Linda had stopped talking. That was the moment Grace knew. Not suspicion anymore. Not worry. Knowing. The kind of knowing that lives in the body before the mind catches up, the blood going cold, the breath shortening, the animal awareness that something enormous and irreversible is half a second away. She tried to pull back, but Linda's hand was already moving. One hard shove, both palms all force, no hesitation, and Grace's cane hit empty air. Her fingers clawed at nothing. The thin iron railing screamed against her palm and gave way, and then she was falling, the river rushing up to meet her, and the last thing she heard before the water closed over her was her own voice. Not a scream, just a name, broken open with everything she'd never been able to say. David. Linda stood at the railing for exactly 4 seconds. She looked down, saw nothing but dark water and foam. Then she took out her phone. She practiced the cry once quietly before she dialed. She'd always been a fast learner. David, she said when he picked up, and the sob was perfect, ragged, real-sounding, collapsed at the edges exactly the way grief collapses. David, something happened, it's your mother. Oh God, oh God, she fell the railing, I tried to catch her, I tried. She let the rest dissolve into sound. She was very good at dissolving into sound. 7 miles downstream, at the far edge of the city, where the river bent toward an industrial district nobody remembered anymore, a man named Samuel was sleeping under an abandoned dock when he heard something that didn't belong. Not a fish, not debris, something with weight to it and breath, barely but breath. Samuel was 53 years old and had been living along that river for 4 years, long enough to know its sounds the way Grace had known voices. He moved fast for a man who'd slept on wet wood. He moved into the water without thinking twice. She was caught against a concrete piling, gray-lipped, blue-fingered, her cardigan shredded, one shoe gone, but breathing, barely but breathing. He got her out. He got her warm. He did not call anyone because Samuel had reasons not to call anyone, and because something in the barely conscious woman's face, the way she gripped his wrist without opening her eyes, the way she shook her head when he reached for the phone in his jacket, told him not to. She came around slowly over hours. When she finally spoke, her voice was like gravel. Don't, she said, don't tell anyone I'm here. Samuel looked at this soaking wet old woman who had clearly been put in the river by someone with intention, and he made a decision that would change both their lives. All right, he said. Grace's injuries were serious. Broken wrist, 3 cracked ribs, hypothermia, a cut along her hairline that had bled far too long before Samuel thought to press his cleanest shirt against it. But she was alive, and she was thinking. She lay in Samuel's makeshift shelter through the first night and cataloged everything, her body, her options, her knowledge. Linda thought she was dead. That was the only advantage she had, and it was everything. The moment the world knew she'd survived, Linda would know, and a woman who had pushed her off a bridge in broad morning would not hesitate to finish the job. Samuel knew a man, a former doctor, quietly disgraced, running a small underground clinic for people who needed care without questions. He brought Grace there at dawn, in a borrowed cart, covered with a tarp that smelled of river mud. The doctor looked at her for a long moment, looked at Samuel, looked back at her. Who did this? He asked. Someone who thinks it's done, Grace said. He set the wrist, wrapped the ribs, cleaned the wound. He didn't ask again. While Grace healed in a room that smelled of antiseptic and old wood, her death was unfolding on the other side of the city with terrifying smoothness. The search and rescue team worked the river for 2 days. Divers went down. Boats dragged nets. They found one shoe and her shattered cane. On the 3rd day, the search was officially reclassified as a recovery operation. On the 5th day, it was suspended. Presumed drowned, the report said. Tragic accident. Failed railing. Authorities investigating the bridge's maintenance record. Not Linda, the railing. David was gutted, hollow. He moved through the memorial arrangements, the friends, the flowers, the casseroles left on the porch like a man underwater himself. He didn't eat. He barely spoke. Linda managed everything. She was extraordinary at it, making calls, accepting condolences, organizing Grace's belongings with the quiet, efficient grief of a devoted daughter-in-law. She donated the coat. She sold the armchair. She canceled the audiobook subscription. She filed the life insurance claim on the 11th day. She'd been named as a co-beneficiary 2 years ago, David's idea actually. He'd insisted, "In case something happens to me first, Mama, I want Linda to be taken care of." Grace had signed without complaint. $260,000. Linda moved through the days like a woman who had waited a very long time for a season to change. And now, finally, it was changing. She didn't know that 7 miles downstream, the dead woman was eating broth, flexing her healing wrist and thinking. In a city newspaper office that smelled permanently of old coffee and new ambition, a journalist named Renata Chen was 3 weeks into what her editor called the fluff piece. A human interest story on river safety after the broken railing incident that had supposedly claimed the life of a blind retired teacher. Renata hated fluff. She had a gift for inconvenient questions. The first inconvenient question was, why had the railing been reported as defective by 3 separate walkers in the 8 months before Grace's death, with no repairs made? That was city negligence. That was a story. The second inconvenient question came when she pulled Grace's background and found David, loving son, clean record, grief-stricken, and Linda beside him, arm around his shoulders in every photo from the memorial, face arranged in perfect sorrow. Renata had seen that face before, not Linda's face, that expression. She started pulling Linda's history the way you pull a loose thread on a sweater, carefully at first, then less carefully, then just pulling. Linda Marsh. Before that, Linda Hargrove. Before that, Linda Delacroix. Before that, and this was where Renata sat up very straight in her chair at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, Linda Vo. 4 names, 4 marriages or near marriages, for men each financially comfortable, 4 exits. First husband, divorced after 18 months citing financial devastation, his savings account emptied, his credit destroyed, his small business somehow in her name. Couldn't prove intent. Settled quietly. Second partner, common law, never legally married, died of what was ruled a cardiac event. He was 44. He had no known heart condition. His adult children had contested the death and lost. He changed his estate paperwork 10 days before the cardiac event to name Linda as primary beneficiary. Third husband. His elderly mother had been institutionalized for sudden onset dementia 6 weeks after Linda moved into the house. The mother had been sharp as a tack before that. She died in the facility 18 months later. The husband had a breakdown and Linda left him, but not before being listed on his investment accounts during the crisis period. And now Grace. Blind, vulnerable, a life insurance policy, a broken railing, a daughter-in-law who cried with perfect precision. Renata called her editor at 11:47 p.m. "Cancel the fluff piece," she said. "I've got something else." She began with the second husband's adult daughter, a woman named Claire who had spent 6 years trying to make someone listen and had mostly stopped trying. When Renata called, Claire went silent for a long moment. Then she said, "What did she go by this time?" They talked for 3 hours. Then Renata called the first ex-husband, who was living small and careful in a different state. He talked for 40 minutes without stopping. Then he said, "Is she doing it again?" "I think so," Renata said. He exhaled long and slow. "What do you need from me?" Meanwhile, David was beginning to feel something shift. He couldn't name it. It was small, a series of small things that shouldn't have bothered him individually, but had started to form a shape he didn't want to look at directly. The insurance paperwork Linda had brought him to sign, he hadn't really read it. He'd been grief-blank for weeks, but he found the copies in her desk when he was looking for stamps and saw the amount, $260,000, and saw the date she'd filed, 11 days. 11 days after his mother's death. He stood in Linda's office with the papers in his hand and told himself there was nothing wrong with this. People had to deal with logistics even in grief. The bills didn't stop. He put the papers back. He went and made coffee. He stood at the kitchen window for a long time. He thought about his mother's last conversation with him 2 nights before the walk. She'd called him. She'd said, carefully in that voice she used when she was trying not to push, "David, I want to ask you something, and I want you to just listen and not get upset." He'd been tired, he'd half listened. He couldn't remember now what she'd said. He'd been half listening and now he couldn't remember, and she was dead, and he would never be able to ask her to say it again. He pressed his forehead against the cold kitchen window and stayed there for a long time. He did not hear Linda come into the room behind him. He did not see the way she watched him, not with the tenderness of a grieving wife, but with the calculation of someone watching a variable she needed to keep stable. Renata published the first part of her story on a Thursday. She was careful. She didn't name Linda directly yet. Her lawyer had been very clear on that. She published it as an investigative piece on a pattern of financial exploitation linked to an unnamed subject, with confirmed accounts from 3 named sources. She published the dates, the states, the amounts. She published the question she kept coming back to: how many times does a pattern have to repeat before it stops being coincidence? The story spread fast. True crime circles picked it up within hours. Someone connected the second husband's name to a forum post from 6 years ago where his daughter had been desperately trying to warn people. The thread got reposted everywhere. By Friday morning, the piece had 200,000 readers. By Friday afternoon, Linda was getting calls she didn't recognize. She didn't answer. She stood in her living room and she read Renata's article twice, very slowly, and she felt the first cold fingers of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not exactly, more like the awareness of a door closing, the very distant sound of something structural shifting. She had survived this kind of thing before. She had always been able to move fast when she needed to. She started calculating. It was Samuel who found David. Grace had spent 3 weeks healing and 3 weeks thinking and had arrived, carefully and with great deliberateness, at a plan. She needed David, not to save her. She was past saving in the traditional sense. She needed him to understand, and she needed him to help close the trap. Samuel watched the house for 2 days, learning Linda's patterns when she left, how long she stayed gone, which errands were genuine and which were cover. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon when Linda had left for what Samuel had identified as a real errand, the dry cleaner, the pharmacy, the nail salon, predictable 90-minute round trip, he went to the door and knocked. David answered. "I need to take you somewhere," Samuel said. "Your mother asked me to." David stared at him. "My mother is dead." "No," Samuel said, "she's not." The clinic was 20 minutes away. David said nothing the entire ride, not one word, not one sound. He sat in the passenger seat of Samuel's borrowed car with his hands flat on his knees and breathed. The room was small. It smelled of antiseptic and the particular warmth of a small electric heater running continuously. There was a single lamp. Grace was sitting up in bed, wrist in a brace, when the door opened. "Mohammed." It came out of David in pieces. Not a word, a fracture. 6 years of marriage, 3 weeks of grief, a lifetime of trying not to look at what he didn't want to see, and one woman sitting alive in a clinic bed looking at him with patient, exhausted love, and the whole thing broke open at once. He crossed the room in 3 steps. She caught him with her good arm. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Grace let him cry. She had done her crying alone in the dark in the first nights when she didn't know if her ribs would hold or if the infection would win. She'd done her falling apart privately, the way she'd done most hard things, without an audience, without asking for help, in the hours when no one was watching. She was steady now. She needed him to be steady too. She gave him time, and then quietly she began to talk. She told him everything. She told him what she'd felt on the bridge. She told him the exact sequence, the grip on her arm changing, the silence where Linda's voice had been, the 2 hands at her back, the intentionality of it. No stumble, no accident, a decision. She told him about Samuel. She told him about the clinic. She told him about choosing to stay dead, not because she was afraid, but because she was thinking. Because the only power she had was the element of surprise, and she intended to use it exactly once and use it correctly. David listened the way he hadn't listened to her call 3 nights before the bridge. He listened with his whole body, leaning forward, not interrupting, not deflecting, not going quiet. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. Then the life insurance. She filed on the 11th day. Grace nodded. "She's done this before." "Done?" He stopped, restarted. "What do you mean, done this before?" Grace reached for the tablet the doctor had set up for her. Renata's article was already pulled up. David read it slowly. His face changed the way a landscape changes when a storm moves across it, gradual, then all at once. By the time he finished, something had closed in his expression. Something settled and hard. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. Renata had been contacted by the clinic doctor through a careful chain of intermediaries. She arrived the next day with a voice recorder, a photographer she trusted completely, and the expression of a woman trying very hard not to show how significant she understood this moment to be. She sat across from Grace for 2 hours. Grace spoke clearly, with dates, with details, with the particular authority of someone who had survived something and processed it fully and was no longer afraid of saying it plainly. She described the morning. She described the bridge. She described the hands. When it was done, Renata sat back and looked at this woman, this 62-year-old blind woman who had been thrown into a river and spent 3 weeks healing in secret, planning, waiting, choosing the exact right moment. And she said, quietly, "Mrs. Grace, you could have gone to the police immediately. You could have called your son. You waited 3 weeks." Grace was quiet for a moment. "Linda has done this 4 times, she said finally, "and she has never been charged with anything, not once. Every time someone came forward too fast, too angry, too broken, she had time to prepare. She had time to build the story, find the witnesses, adjust the narrative." A pause. "I am blind. I am 62 years old. I am not fast, but I am patient. And I have learned that the only time you go after someone like Linda is when you have everything, every thread, every witness, every document, when there is no gap left for her to move through." Renata wrote for a long time without speaking. "We need to give the police a few more days," Grace said. "Let them pull the records. Let Renata's story do what it's already doing. And then—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Linda knew the net was tightening. She was very good at knowing this. It was perhaps her only genuine talent, reading the shift in the air before the storm arrived, knowing when a city was no longer safe, knowing when to become someone else in someone else's place. She had started moving money, small amounts, nothing that would trigger an alert, into an account she kept separately. She had a bag half-packed in the back of her closet. She had a name she hadn't used in years that still had a clean passport attached to it. She just needed a few more days. She just needed David to stay stable. She was watching him carefully. He was grieving. He was withdrawn, but he wasn't suspicious. He was just broken. Broken men were easy to manage. She came home on a Thursday to find the house quiet, and the lights low, and David sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded. "You're home early," she said, keeping her voice warm. "I needed to talk to you," David said. She set down her bag, sat across from him, arranged her face into concern and love and exhaustion, the triple-layer mask she'd worn for 3 years. "Of course," she said. "What's going on?" David looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Tell me about the bridge." Something happened in Linda's eyes. Small, fast, gone in an instant, replaced immediately by confusion and grief. "David." "Tell me," he said again. "Tell me exactly what happened. Walk me through it." She did. She had told this story many times. She was very good at it. She built it brick by brick, the morning, the walk, the railing, the horror, Grace's scream, her own useless hands reaching, and she made her voice break at exactly the right moments, and she pressed her fingers to her eyes, and she was the picture of a woman reliving the worst moment of her life. When she finished, David nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, "for telling me again." He got up, he put his cup in the sink, he went upstairs. Linda sat alone at the table for a moment, recalibrating. Something felt wrong, something in his voice, his posture. She shook it off. He was just grieving. Broken men asked questions. It didn't mean anything. She would be gone by the weekend. She was not gone by the weekend. Friday morning, 2 plainclothes detectives knocked on the door. They were polite. They were thorough. They had Renata's documentation and the testimony of 3 previous victims, and as of late Thursday night, the statement of a blind woman who was very much alive and waiting to tell them everything. She remembered about 2 specific hands and 1 very deliberate push. Linda answered the door in her robe, and for 1/2 second, just one, her face showed something true, something cracked and animal and cornered. Then the mask came back. But the detectives had been told what to look for, and they had seen it. They asked her to come with them. She said she needed to change. She was gone for 4 minutes. When she came back, her bag was gone from the closet and her phone had been wiped. But the detectives had expected that too. They had someone at the back door. The moment Renata had been building toward, the one she called the resurrection in her notes, because she was also something of a storyteller, was published in full on Saturday morning. Blind woman SURVIVES bridge attack. Daughter-in-law ARRESTED. Linked to pattern of crimes across 4 states. The photo was Grace's choice. Taken by Renata's photographer 2 days earlier, in the clinic, Grace sitting straight-backed and composed, her healed wrist in its brace, her sightless eyes looking forward with an expression that had no name exactly. Not anger, not triumph, not grief. Something beyond all of those. Something that only comes from surviving something unsurvivable and choosing, very carefully, what to do next. 36 hours, 1 million readers, then 3 million, then more. Claire, the second husband's daughter, saw it at breakfast and sat down on her kitchen floor and cried for 40 minutes. The first ex-husband, in his careful small apartment in a different state, read it twice and then called Renata and said, "Tell her thank you. Tell the blind woman thank you." Grace left the clinic on a Tuesday, 3.5 weeks after she'd arrived, walking slower than she used to, one wrist still tender but walking. Samuel drove her. She'd asked him once what she could do for him and he'd said he didn't need anything. She'd told him that was fine. She wasn't asking about need, she was asking about want. He'd thought about it for a while and said he wouldn't mind a real bed for a while. She'd made a call. He had one by Thursday. She did not go back to the house she'd shared with David. Not yet. She went first to a hotel, quiet, ordinary, and slept for 14 hours dreamlessly. When she woke up, she lay in the dark for a while and took stock. Linda was in custody. The insurance claim was frozen pending the investigation. 3 other jurisdictions had opened inquiries. The evidence was layered and documented, and there were witnesses now, real ones, who had spent years waiting to be believed and were finally being given a room and a recorder and someone who listened. David called twice a day. He was in the kind of pain that rearranges a person, the particular devastation of learning that love can be counterfeited so completely that you build your life around it and can't tell the difference until someone hands you the receipt. He had a long road. Grace knew that. She was patient. She had always been patient. She had just never before understood that patience wasn't weakness. It wasn't waiting for someone else to act. It was the slow, careful, deliberate assembly of everything you need before you move, so that when you finally move, there is no margin for failure. Linda had been fast. Linda had been smooth. Linda had been practiced across 4 different lives with 4 different names and 4 different sets of victims. But Grace had been patient. And in the end, patience had won. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in the way movies show justice, the dramatic courtroom revelation, the gasp of the crowd, the villain finally crumbling. Quietly, methodically, brick by brick, thread by thread, witness by witness, until the structure was so complete and so solid that there was no longer any way through it, around it, or under it. Linda would be tried, the insurance money would never arrive, the passport would be useless, the new name was burned. And Grace would testify, clearly, calmly. In that patient voice that had survived the river, and 3 weeks in a clinic, and the kind of betrayal most people couldn't imagine. She would tell the jury everything. She was very good at telling the truth. She had nothing but time. Grace never asked to be anyone's lesson. She was just a woman who went for a walk and trusted the wrong person and fell into darkness. But she came back. Not loudly, not immediately, prepared. And that is the thing about real survival. It isn't the moment you don't break. It's the moment you choose what to do while you're still broken. Grace chose to wait. She chose to think. She chose to build something that couldn't be undone. That's not a fairy tale, that's a blueprint. If this story stopped you, if something in it made you think about the people in your own life you've been half listening to, the warnings you've been explaining away, the instincts you've been talking yourself out of, this channel exists for exactly that. Every story here is about people who faced impossible things and refused to let impossible be the last word. If you're new here, subscribe now. Hit that bell. These stories go out regularly, and you don't want to be the person who finds this channel 6 months late. If you're already subscribed, tell one person, just one. Grace wasn't found by a system. She was found by one man sleeping under a dock who decided to pay attention. One person paying attention changes everything. Drop Grace in the comments if her story moved you. And if you've ever known someone like Linda, someone whose warmth never quite matched the temperature behind their eyes, you don't have to say their name. Just say, "I know." We'll understand. Until the next story, stay awake, stay close, and remember, the truth doesn't always arrive loudly, but it always arrives.